Hello? Mic check.
Hi, Tabiso.
Hey, Tabi, how's it?
I'm all right, leadership. How are you?
Good, good. Busi, hi, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Good, Tabi, hi, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Good. Nice to get finally put a face to the emails. So, Tapio, is it just us now?
So we have on the line,
Mm-hmm.
we have Dr. Tabi. Kaya is now available in Busi, so we're waiting for Lumkile.
Okay. And what about Edgar, the DSG?
Edgar as well, he has not yet logged in.
Yeah, he's the only one I'm really worried about.
No, I'll drop him a side note just now.
Okay, cool, awesome.
Yeah, I was in a meeting with him earlier.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay. Did it seem like you had a hectic schedule, or I never know, because like it always goes through, like you never speak to the person directly. It always goes through like different channels. So I never know. Are you guys all in Joburg, by the way?
Yeah, I'm in Joburg.
No more people in Johannesburg.
Okay. And what's the whole COVID situation looking like there? It looks like a spike now. I'm here in the Western Cape. I'm in the Western Cape. So for weeks my family's in Joburg. So for weeks I've been just getting calls from Joburg saying, yeah, can we pray for you and what?
And now it's the other way around.
That was the other way around. I'm giving them a call. Say, hey, how's it going there? Kind of thing. We probably shouldn't do that, but hey, I mean.
We're fine. We just stick indoors. Social distance, wear masks. We don't go surfing.
Yeah, we definitely at that phase where we all know of someone who has COVID or know of someone who knows someone who has COVID. So it's literally like 1 degree away or 2.
Yeah, no, it's not a, like, it's a real thing, you know. It's not a joke, you know. So usually it's like it's far away up until it hits your front door.
Lumkile is now on.
Hello, Tabi.
Hi, Lumkile.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Age is difficult. What could you do? No freedom of movement, you know.
I can't see you though.
You can't see me, sorry.
The last time you were rocking an afro, so I'm glad that you kind of like, you know, put it down.
Now to chop it after the.
Yeah, there was I saw a picture of you actually when you did an interview, and I thought, yo, it's bad.
That's bad. I aged so much. Hello,
No,
Tabi.
you just didn't comb your hair. That's the thing.
How are you?
A big afro.
Hello, Busi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, and you?
I'm good. It's been a long time. I'm so used to seeing you guys.
Yeah. Are you well?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Hi, are you there?
Lumkile, put your light on.
Let me try and do that. I'll disappear a bit.
Okay.
You?
Yeah, that's better. That's better. Now
much better.
Yeah.
Does it look better now?
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry.
You were just dark. We couldn't see you.
I'm an economist. They live in the dark.
Tapiwa,
Hello.
so now just on a question of etiquette, like what do you want us to do here when speakers go or whatever? Should the
So it's quite simple.
I just want to warn you that we are live, so whoever signed in can hear us.
Okay, cool. I was thinking,
Reminds me of that other panel discussion with the government.
but
I'm not going to say who was hosting it.
Good evening to everyone who has joined us, those who are on the webinar live, and those who are on YouTube. We'll be starting shortly in the next 4 minutes, so please just bear with us. Yes. All right, good evening, everyone. Once again, my name is Tapiwa Elias, and I'm from the ABSIP National Office. Welcome to our supplementary budget speech review. The aim of this webinar is to discuss the extraordinary budget tabled by the Minister on 24 June 2020 as the government's initial economic and fiscal response to COVID-19. We've invited a panel of economists to discuss the forthcoming spending framework aimed to stabilize debt and narrow the budget deficit in the unprecedented pandemic. The program for tonight is quite simple. We will hear from our ABSIP representative, our Deputy Secretary General. You're welcome and open the event. And we're to hear from a representative from National Treasury, but he has not logged in yet. But who actually, apologies to that, I see has just logged in now. So we have an address from Edgar Shishi, who's from the National Treasury. And then we'll have a panel discussion that will be moderated by Kaya Stolle. And then afterwards, we'll get a Q&A, which will be for the panel and the speaker. Then we have a closing afterwards. So without wasting much of your time, we'll start. I would like to welcome Thabiswa Ratshefola, who is the ABSIP Secretary General, to open the event.
thanks, Tapiwa. Well, just on behalf of ABSIP and the ABSIP NEC, I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar. We don't have much time, so I'm not going to bombard you all with all the great and wonderful things that ABSIP is doing. But I'm going to tell you that we're really, really excited for this event in particular. As many of you know, one of the core missions of ABSIP is to be a lead custodian for transformation in the economy. And I think when we have engagements like this, which really unpack, where the economy is and where we're going, it really helps us, in our advocacy role to really try and push engagements and really try and navigate the current situation in line with our mission. So we're really honored for the caliber of speakers that we have today who are coming to share their insights and really help us unpack the budget. We'd like to make a special thanks to National Treasury for being a part of this event. It really, really does mean a lot to us. To our panelists, who are each titans in their own right, we really like to make a special thanks to you. I saw some of the questions that the moderator has for you guys, and all I'm going to say to the panelists is good luck. Honestly, it's an honor to have you all here, and really we are looking forward to a fruitful engagement. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is hand it back to Tapio, and I just want to say thank you all for joining the webinar. I encourage you all to engage, especially in the Q&A session, and let's really, really make this a fruitful engagement. Thanks, Tapio. I'm going to hand it off back to you.
Thank you, Tabiso. In the spirit of time as well, let me check if Edgar is now audible. Mr. Mashishi, if you can hear me, the time has come for you to give the address to the ABSIP membership. We have people on this webinar, and also we are live on the YouTube channel. So if you may take the floor and deliver your address. Thank you.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, and apologies for the Deputy Minister who was not able to make it this evening. I had a couple of technical delays, so I'm not sure if anything was said prior to me logging on, but I will go straight then into, I guess, my presentation. So we tabled the special adjustments budget on the 24th of June, last week, Wednesday. The Minister tabled in the supplementary budget speech and the supplementary budget review, which my office crafted. There are numerous considerations in this regard. And one of the things that I want to just touch on today is to look and think about where we were prior to the crisis, entering this current crisis, when the COVID pandemic hit. This happened or started happening basically around about the time that I joined the budget office, or I took over the budget office in March. But what was obvious prior to the current crisis is that South Africa's pre-crisis macroeconomic and fiscal position was quite weak. Economic growth in 2019 was 0.2%. The fiscal variables were also very weak. The tax base was not growing. Debt was mounting, and debt service costs were increasingly crowding out other items of government expenditure. If you look at the areas of economic weakness, it is quite clear that it was very broad-based, but also that it was a long-run economic weakness in the case of South Africa. The decade after 2010 was one of the longest periods of economic expansion, or rather after 2009, was one of the longest periods of economic expansion in world history. Globally, economic growth at times reached 3.5% in terms of global GDP. And yet at the same time, South Africa's economic performance weakened and did so fairly consistently throughout the decade. South Africa was one of only 2 emerging market economies last year to be in recession at the end of the year. The other was Mexico. The others were all growing, and in many cases they were growing very handily indeed. And this included developing countries in the African continent, which were growing very strongly. So South Africa had decoupled from global growth. And we consider that the explanation for this was the long-run structural gaps and structural failings in the economy and numerous supply-side constraints. One of the reasons why we believe this is the case is that the data showed that every time there was an economic downturn and the business cycle turned downwards, South Africa's recovery was always weaker than the pre-crisis condition. So if you look at South Africa's long-run economic trajectory, what you find is that each trough was lower than the previous, and each peak was lower than the previous peak. And this to us speaks of structural constraints in the economy. So when considering the special adjustment budget, we considered 2 things. First, that we have to respond strongly to the COVID pandemic. And secondly, we have to consider our pre-crisis position as well as how that has changed because of the crisis. The frequency of fiscal crises is increasing. And this episode will likely not be any different. Some of you will have seen the Global Financial Stability Report on the contingent effects of the current sovereign debt accumulation. It's quite likely that the accumulation of debt by governments around the world will lead to another financial crisis. Some of you will also have seen the warnings from the former governor of the Bank of England about the impact of the current accumulation of sovereign debt, and that future financial crises will come sooner than they have in the past. South Africa is currently unprepared for such crises. Whether it is a financial crisis or another generalized economic crisis, a resurgence in trade wars, higher oil prices, or some other exogenous or idiosyncratic domestic event, we will not be able to respond as a result of our weakened fiscal position. Meanwhile, debt service costs are increasingly crowding out spending on public goods and investment spending. Next year, debt service costs will be higher than total government spending on healthcare. And in the year thereafter, debt service costs will be higher than total spending on basic education. Obviously, we have to respond to the COVID crisis this year. And in this regard, we have expanded our fiscal gap, which was already a structural gap from years before. South Africa was already spending beyond its revenue. The South African government was already spending beyond its revenue for many years prior to the current crisis. In fact, South Africa's fiscal stance has been expansionary for many years, including the current year. Despite the criticisms from some quarters that the February budget was a budget of cuts, it is in fact empirically an expansionary budget. If you look at both the increase in non-interest expenditure, as well as the assessment of the cyclically adjusted primary balance, South Africa's fiscal stance this year is more expansionary than many developing countries around the world. In fact, there was some data produced by UBS the other day that showed that adjusted for South Africa's cyclical position, our fiscal stance is more expansionary than the fiscal stance of the People's Republic of China. So South Africa is a country that has not experienced any kind of fiscal austerity. In fact, our current fiscal stance is very much expansionary. The question then is, can we sustain this expansionary fiscal policy? And does this expansionary fiscal policy align with our economic condition? We did an analysis of the relationship between government spending and investment in the economy using gross fixed capital formation as a proxy from the 1960s till today. A 60-year analysis of government spending. And what we found is that it is not necessarily true that an increase in government spending translates into higher investment in the economy. In fact, since 2015-16, there has been a negative correlation between increases in government spending and increases in investment in the overall economy. So our task was to balance between the need to respond to the current crisis on the one hand, and the need to address what we consider to be a looming debt crisis on the other. We responded to the first challenge by tabling what is, we believe, one of the larger interventions in the economy in the developing world. The 500 billion rand package that government has committed itself to amounts to over 10% of GDP. And at the time of announcement, it was larger than all the economic interventions of the developing countries that are members of the G20. In addition, we also have very significant monetary policy response. The South African Reserve Bank has cut the repo rate by 250 basis points over the last few months. And we have noted that the median for emerging market economies is 100 basis points. So the Reserve Bank has gone far and beyond what the median is across the developing world. In addition, the liquidity program of the Reserve Bank has made a significant difference in the risk premium and the long-term bond yields, leading to cheaper costs for borrowing of government in the short term. But the second challenge remains, which is that we spend far more than we can afford. There is a structural gap between revenue and spending that predates the current crisis. And our fiscal matrices are increasingly dominated by mounting debt and debt service costs. We now estimate that if we continue on the current path, the total debt of government will be larger than the size of the economy in the year 2023, 2024 in financial year terms, 106% of GDP, and will reach just under 141% of GDP by the end of the decade. Under the current scenario, interest on that debt will reach 31% of total revenue of government by the middle of the decade, and will reach 40% of total revenue by the end of the decade. Our entire fiscal position will, by the end of this decade, be focused on transferring our wealth to foreign bondholders. And so we have decided that that is an unacceptable scenario. And we went to cabinet earlier this month with an alternative, which we call the active scenario. The active scenario is designed to address the problem of mounting debt, prevent a debt crisis, and by so doing contribute to long-run economic growth. We considered that in order to stabilize the public finances, we needed to target a primary surplus. In other words, a balance between non-interest spending and government revenue by the year 2023-24 in order to stabilize debt at 87.4% of GDP. By doing this, we will avoid a scenario in which a fiscal crisis extracts from growth. And in this regard, we consider that a fiscal crisis, can extract up to 2 trillion rands from GDP this decade if it is not addressed. And so we considered that the fiscal position that we are tabling at the MTBPS, which we signaled last week, Wednesday, will prevent that fiscal crisis and the economic damage that it will bring. It will lower the risk premia of the sovereign. It will ensure that we don't borrow at costs we cannot afford. And it will also ensure that the negative correlation between government spending and overall investment in the economy is arrested. So in closing, let me just reiterate in 30 seconds what I've just said. We had to address a very delicate and difficult balance with the supplementary budget. On the one hand, we had a crisis, a health crisis with coronavirus, the COVID pandemic. And on the other hand, we had a looming fiscal crisis that, if unaddressed, would extract from growth and damage the economy over the long run. And so we have tabled an expansionary fiscal position for the year, and we are proposing a consolidation of the fiscal position after that in order to achieve a stabilization of debt and to ensure that we prevent a debt crisis that could damage the economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shishi, for that well-indulged background. From that, I would like to inform everyone that we will take Q&As after the panel that is coming. You can type these questions on YouTube, or you can put them in the question and answer segment here on Zoom. We'll take those questions, and if we're going to take voice questions, you'll be notified as such. So without wasting time, I would like to introduce Mr. Kaya Sitole, who is the ABSIP Treasurer General, to welcome the panel and then kickstart. Mr. Kaya.
Hello. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Good evening to all the delegates and of course the panelists, and also special welcome to Mr. Shishi himself. Now, the important thing about my panelists is that they're far too famous for me to worry about having to introduce them. We all know them as the people who never get anything right, because economists always predict on the basis that if they get it wrong, they'll say they'll simply apply their judgment. So that's one thing that unites them. The collective inability to never ever tell us the final number. That being said, I'd like to mention that we do have this.
Hi, Kaya. Kaya, I think we're all struggling to hear you.
Who is a researcher and an economist with the Institute for Economic Justice, and also
Kaya.
Very popular on Twitter, so
Kaya.
I can see what she said about the budget.
Kaya, we're struggling to hear you. May you please maybe switch off your video for now and continue.
On the Twitter street. So that is the crux of the panel. And I think what we are going to do first and foremost is that we have to reflect on what last week Wednesday to see just how famous she is on the tweet.
Kaya.
Or at least is that we have, and that is simply saying that last week's budget was the current healthcare crisis, which we all know about, and then also the longer-term project of the looming financial crisis. So what I'd like to do is firstly ask my panelists themselves whether they actually believe that the budget as tabled last week was able to address any of these issues. So I'll start in the current healthcare crisis, which we all know about.
Kaya, can you hear me?
Whether they actually believe. I'll start with you, Tabi.
I think I've heard a bit, but this is what happens when you make non-funny jokes, unfunny jokes about economists.
It says that the budget that they tabled last week had these particular objectives. Can you all hear me?
No, we didn't hear. We heard half of what you said.
Oh, okay. I think because somebody was sabotaging me and deciding to switch off my mic, it wasn't me. So I think, Tabi, we'll start with you. The first issue that has been raised here is that the purpose of last week's budget was to deal with the healthcare crisis. And I obviously want to distinguish that from a longer-term issues which obviously predated the crisis. Having listened to the 40-minute delivery by the finance minister last week, did you feel that at least that primary objective of saying, let us table a budget that deals with the current healthcare crisis, would you say that that was achieved?
Thanks for the question, Kaya. I didn't quite hear it clearly, but I think I understand what you're alluding to, or what your question is trying to state. So you're saying that even though this is a health crisis, did the minister do enough to deal with the health crisis? So to start off, I think that yes, it started off as a health crisis, but it also then became an economic crisis, and that is why we had the supplementary budget to deal with both the consequences of the pandemic on the economy and also on our health, and the impact of the pandemic on health. I think that Mr. Shisi, had a great kind of background in terms of why we're here and the issues that, or the difficulties in terms of budgeting and why it was so difficult for Treasury to get to where they are. I think that he is right in many aspects that, for instance, this is an expansionary budget, but at the same time, where I criticize what he said is that we were supposed to be consolidating up until now. And because we didn't consolidate, we find ourselves in this position where we don't have fiscal space and fiscal room to deal with a crisis. And that's why we're in this position where other countries have actually done more than us in terms of fiscal support. And I think that we could have done a lot more. We reprioritized about 109 billion rands, and I think that it's insufficient given the impact of the crisis on the economy. I think what makes South Africa stand out a little bit more than other emerging markets is exactly what you said, is that leading to this crisis, we had 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. So we're really starting on a back foot. So we actually need to dig deeper in us, for us to put a buffer and help save the economy. I think, again, leading to the crisis, our deficit that was estimated by the National Treasury was supposed to be just under 7%, and we expect it now to increase to over 15 point, around 15.6%. I think that is also very troubling, given that it's double what we estimated in February. I also think that we have crowded out in terms of, because we're paying so much towards debt, we are crowding out the ability to pay towards health, which is what needs to be done currently. I think we allocated 20-odd billion rands towards health, which I don't think is sufficient. And I do know that the National Treasury will flesh out more in terms of spending in October at the MTBPS. I think that, looking at just the composition of our expenditure is the main problem. I think we know where the constraints are on the revenue side, but on the expenditure side, I feel that National Treasury is bouncing around the elephant in the room, and we know that the elephant in the room is wages, public sector wages. And again, I felt that you didn't deal with this at the supplementary budget. The minister was actually quite, shrugged his shoulders and said, well, we'll see how the negotiations go, and good luck with those who are negotiating this. Unfortunately, this is very important because the expenditure, I think as I mentioned earlier today in a previous meeting with the National Treasury, that the bulk of the expenditure is autonomous. So you can't really move a lot of it unless you make really drastic changes. This includes wages, this includes grants, this is the fee-free education, and if you include NHI, you leave very little room actually. Should we have a second pandemic at the end of the year or next year, or a prolonged lockdown, there will be very little funding from the budget, because a lot of it is actually quite static and already autonomous. So there's very little room to actually find funding, fund any extra budget, including especially health. And I know that you did take money away out of the NHI in this reprioritization, which I found was interesting because leading up to the pandemic, I wasn't a supporter of the NHI for various reasons, because of, government doesn't always deal with big projects well, and there's a lot of corruption and leakages, and that was my reservation initially. But with the pandemic, it's quite clear that the national healthcare is very important, and instead of actually allocating more resources towards this, funds were taken out of the NHI. So I think that we are stuck, we are stuck at wages, we're stuck at grants. The politics are a huge factor in terms of how you allocate resources. And unfortunately, you are left to dance around the elephant in the room instead of actually dealing with it. And if you dealt with it, I think you'd have a lot more room to maneuver and a lot more room to actually allocate resources more appropriately. I do think, I do sympathize, because I know that a lot of this is political, and you are right in that you need to, you take this to the politicians to endorse. So if they don't, if it's not palatable to them, half of it won't go through. So I do think that you have a big task ahead of you. I do wish that more resources should be allocated towards health, but I do understand that there's very little that you can do. I am worried that we're going to incur more taxes because we can't find resources within the current budget. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Tabi. Busi Sibego, the Institute for Economic Justice had long before the budget speech actually penned a proposal on how South Africa ought to respond to this healthcare crisis. Obviously, you have been watching last week's budget presentation with a lot of eyes on trying to figure out whether any of those proposals actually translate into economic action. But of course, those would have been predated by the president's announcement. So when you heard last week's speech, did you feel that at least the government had explored the various dimensions that the Institute had put together in its proposal earlier this year?
Thank you for that question. I think generally we had expected the package that had been announced by the president, and even though we felt that it was not adequate, particularly in terms of livelihoods and supporting those who disadvantaged in particular, we thought, to be implemented in a way that would hopefully lead us to a better place. But I have to admit that last week when I saw the budget, I was not really happy about it. And the reason being that 500 billion that was announced hasn't materialized. And on the budget, it isn't 500 billion. if you look at it, the 100 billion that was allocated to the job creation has only been reduced to 6 billion for this year. From what I understand about a relief package, it has to be immediately spent, right? So spent within a short period of time so that we can preserve the economy. And I see on the budget the written a section about preserving the current economy. And if we're spending 100 billion for job creation in the medium term, it therefore is not a relief package for COVID-19. It is anticipated spend in the long run. Certainly, we had proposed 20 billion for health, and 20 billion was allocated by the president, which we were happy about. But when we actually analyze the budget, it's only 2.9 billion that is the net increase to the health bill. And we worry about that because where the money is being reprioritized is a lot of conditional grants. And the reason why we worry about that is because in the future, we're going to be left with structures, particularly hospital structures that haven't been updated because we were busy building field hospitals as opposed to updating the infrastructure for those hospitals. I think in terms of the social grants, we're very disappointed that the number was reduced from 50 billion to 41 billion, particularly because, as we know, only 1.5 million people, according to the budget, have received the social relief grant for the unemployed. But also what's surprising is that today we saw some data from SASA that says that majority of the people who were rejected, they were misinformed about their UIF. And so we worry a lot about capacity to deliver, considering that it's been over 100 days since the emergency response was announced, yet so many people have still not been able to access those grants to really keep them going, especially in the context of high job losses. I think just lastly to say that we are, just to also respond to this idea, and as you know, the Institute for Economic Justice, we've been very vocal about it being an austerity budget. And just to say that I know that people say that the budget in February was not an austerity budget, but actually, when you look at the numbers and calculate, you realize that there's a net decrease of the budget by 38 billion over the NCD. And so when you think about this and compare it to the 36 billion that's being added, that's only the next increase to the current budget to accommodate COVID-19. So that's very little, especially since technically 32 billion. So the net cut from the February NCF plus the COVID increase actually means that the net effect is very low. And so I'm really against actually calling it in a fiscal stimulus, which we'll come back to resuming. But in the context of the budget cuts that have been happening, I would argue that this is the relief that we had hoped for, and that we will need a fiscal stimulus in the future to address the shortfalls that we currently and to be able to recover.
Thank you, Busi. Lumkile, I think one of the big issues that I've had with the process that we've undertaken is that even the response that government was putting together, which is to say they think perhaps we needed a 500 billion rand conversation, that was something that was crafted months ago at the point in time where very little was known about how really the pandemic was going to unfold in South Africa and across the world. The type of projections that would have been in place at that point in time would probably have needed to be adapted. And yet the budget that we heard last week was essentially confirming the 500 billion rand that was committed to in what might well turn out to be a very different environment from where we are right now. What was your view on just the government saying 500 billion rand is still where we think we should nail our mast and put together a package?
In fact, we're very disappointed with the supplementary budget because that 500 billion rand had moved us closer to the 10% that we'd seen many governments had put on the table. So if you look at the US Fed, I'm worried about starting my video because I might not be heard. If people do get not to hear what I'm hearing, I'll switch it off. So just warn me if you can't hear me. I was saying that the UK, the US, and many other countries, in their intervention to the economic, financial, as well as the health crisis, decided to inject about 10% of their gross domestic product. So when the half a trillion rand was announced by the president and the Minister of Finance put the plan in detail, we're very encouraged. Of course, many of us wanted more than what was put on the table. But what we saw on last week was very disappointing because a lot of that support which was promised has not filtered through. We all know that, for example, on the support for the unemployed, 85% of those that applied were turned away, meaning that very little has been spent on that. You know, so many people are destitute at the moment and are hungry. So, Kaya, to answer your question, is that the crisis that we find ourselves, we thought will require much more innovation from the Treasury. As we all know that it is the Treasury that had put us in this crisis in the first place. Remember that from 2010, Treasury had shared with South Africans high levels of growth and therefore high levels of revenue expenditure. Under Pravin Gordhan, all those targets were missed and he kept on spending. And we all know that the quality of the spending was very, very poor because we had very little to show for it. And the back of that, the Reserve Bank had also cut interest rate drastically. So we had both expansionary fiscal and monetary policy, which did not drive the growth that was required for us to address our problems. So really, Treasury here is playing with fire. They went on an expansionary phase, knowing that the money was not being spent effectively and continue spending. And we now know how that poor money was spent. And Treasury is asking us to undergo an austerity. Very interestingly, Akaya, just as his last point, is that if you look at the last period when South Africa ran a budget surplus, it was under the Mbeki regime. According to Mark Gevisa in his book, A Dream Deferred, Mark Gevisa argues that Mbeki was a man of self-reliance. So his neoliberal policy document of growth, employment, and redistribution was implemented as a means to self-reliance rather than capitulation to old colonial masters. At the core of the growth, employment, and redistribution program was the fear of the begging bowl, of giving up South Africa's limited sovereignty to the IMF and the World Bank as a result of a financial crisis that Mr. Sishi has shared with us, that is looming. So therefore, it is very interesting for me that South Africa today has got a begging bowl. And with the begging bowl, the middle class and the elite are going to be benefiting from the redistribution of income as the poor, through the austerity, get marginalized. So looking at 40% unemployment, we're looking at a poverty level increasing above 55%, inequality widening. Is this really what the Treasury can deliver to the masses of our people when in fact it had gone on expenditure from 2010 and yet we saw nothing, and today are being asked to take the pay? Kaya.
Thanks, Lumkile. I mean, you call for innovation in how these things ought to be done. My question to you, but having looked at, the state of public finances, the fiscal cliff that we're already approaching, could there have been any sense of innovation that could be implemented in the short term? I mean, if you do say, let us accept the proposition that innovation is still possible, what would that mean? What would it have meant for last week's budget?
For example, Kaya, with the UK government, who didn't have an economic crisis despite them exiting from the European Union. With the health crisis, the central bank, the Bank of England, decided to be the buyer of last resort for medical supplies, specifically ventilators. The idea was to stimulate manufacturing domestically So you're addressing two crises. You're addressing a crisis of demand by stimulating demand and manufacturing and empowering these manufacturers to do what was needed. And at the same time, you're making sure that the crisis is addressed through the central bank intervention. And we're calling upon the Reserve Bank to be more imaginary and more imaginative about the power it has. I'm not talking, Kaya, here about printing money. I'm talking about other ways of supporting the state and ensuring that we don't go and forego and give up our sovereignty. And eventually we'll find ourselves that we've got both a currency crisis and we default because we don't have hard currency. And that's my ask, is that can we look more innovative in the central bank and see what best it can do? We've seen what the UK can do, what South Africa can do. I know that they did buy some of the bonds of government in the secondary market, but I think they can do more.
Thank you, Lumkile. Tabi, one of the issues that Lumkile raises is perhaps the state can do more to stimulate local manufacturing, for example, perhaps, localizing the manufacturing of ventilators. A few weeks ago, you hosted a similar webinar where the CEO of the Solidarity Fund actually told us that, the bulk of the capital expenses in relation to this crisis, being the ventilators and all those high-tech machinery, were actually being sourced overseas. I think the number that she cited was 92%. So the best intentions notwithstanding, could that have been possible to then say, let us redirect a lot of the purchases locally? Do we have that type of capacity?
We don't currently have the capacity, and many countries globally don't have the capacity, and that's why the majority of all the countries have accessed PPEs from China and I believe Vietnam. So the African continent also has a number, whereas I think 95% of countries on the continent also source their, so 95% of PPEs on the continent come from China. So I think that with what has happened with the pandemic and the fact that also the global value chains have been disrupted, I think it is correct to look internally and look at potential to localize. And I think that we have pivoted quite well given the time periods that we were pressured to do so. We are manufacturing ventilators, something that we never did before. And also we are sourcing and creating PPEs in South Africa and also on the continent. I think that in a very strange, warped way, that the pandemic has made us realize that we actually do have resources domestically and we can utilize our domestic endowments to provide us with what we need. And domestically, I don't just refer to South Africa, I also refer to the rest of the continent.
All right, Tabi, thank you. Busi, I mean, one of the big issues that the Institute of Economic Justice in particular was really focusing on is the type of social relief assistance that we knew was going to be necessary in the lockdown, that we now know is definitely necessary given how long this lockdown has endured. But yet I hear every day the stories about people that were supposed to get the 350 Rand grant, for example, still not getting it. We've got issues relating to people that are supposed to be accessing benefits from the UIF, also struggling to do so. I mean, having understood just what needed to be done and then committing to doing it, how, in your view, has government fared in really rolling out the type of assistance packages that were really critical in getting people through this pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the government has really, 100 days in, I think it's sufficient to say that government has not done enough to ensure that livelihoods are protected. And this has been an ongoing theme in this speech by the president, in this speech by the finance minister, livelihoods and lives. And in terms of lives, we've seen the allocation cut off, but in terms of livelihoods, that's not the case. And the first area that we critiqued was this idea that the child grant was actually increasing per caregiver as opposed to per beneficiary. which would mean that there are many, the impacts are different, right? Because if you've got more children, it means you only have 500 Rand increase as opposed to if you have one child and you've got the 500 Rand for that child. That's the first thing. Secondly, I think the issue of it's punitive to women, how it was structured, because if you are a woman accessing the social grant, it means that you can't apply for the social relief grant. If you are the recipient of your children's child grant, it means that you can't access the social relief grant. So it is extremely punitive to women. And when you look at the numbers actually seen today from SASSA, you can see that women make up about half of the applicants and recipients of the social relief grant. So we were deeply worried about this. And in addition to that, I think we were also worried that, of course, 350 Rand is not enough. We know that the poverty line in South Africa is 1,227. And so we know that even 350 is below the food poverty line, which is about 400 and something Rand. So already we thought that wasn't enough, but at least it was something. But the slow way in which it's been implemented is worrisome in many ways, because as we know, very few people have received it, 1.5 million according to the budget. But of course, SASSA today claims that it's about 2-point-something million. So I think generally we felt that and in terms of the UIF, we felt that, it needed to be expanded. Luckily, some of the civil society organizations we work with did take government to, or rather not government, but did take this to court to say that UIF should be expanded. And luckily that was a win on our end, which was that the UIF should be extended to informal workers. But we did worry about informal workers and continuously do so, and believe that the UIF should cover more people than those who contribute to it, particularly because there's such large inequalities in this country.
Thank you, Bosi. Lumke, I mean, we have to now deal with the big elephant in the room, as Atabi said earlier on, in that if the state is going to say that they are struggling to balance the books, well, somebody will say you balance the books either by raising the revenue or by cutting costs. It sounds quite straightforward, and yet here we are talking about a looming a fiscal crisis that is happening within the next 5 years. We are talking about 140% of GDP at some point in time being our net borrowing. If the solutions are as clear, at least in design or at least in ideology, as I've set them out to be, why are we struggling to implement them?
Because of ideology, Kaya. Remember, we do have some beautiful assets within the state which can be sold. And the state basically doesn't want to entertain any privatization. Remember, we've got assets across South Africa of infrastructure in the airports. We've got an SAA, I don't know how much we get out of it. We've got quite a lot of assets, which at least the state could be talking about to show how serious it is in terms of its commitment to reduce cost. So to really target public sector workers' wages, I think without necessarily committing to much broader adjustment, that's why we argue that this is austerity. If the state was thinking more innovatively about doing other things, such as the one I've suggested, where the Reserve Bank play the central role in certain areas to reinvigorate certain sectors, we now will be talking. I think all this is just a buying time for a looming crisis where mass unemployment and poverty may lead to populist sentiments and a populist regime takes over. And that populist regime just basically goes out to print money and mismanage, and very soon we've got a failed state and we default across many of our debt. We've seen this being played elsewhere in the world, not far away across the border. So I think South Africa, if we don't use this opportunity to be innovative, we may find ourselves being exposed to populist policy making, taking shortcuts with tears at the end of the day.
Lumkele, I think when it comes to the Reserve Bank and what it can and cannot do, there is a general lack of consensus around the type of instruments that the Reserve Bank has at its disposal. The Reserve Bank governor would argue that him, as the custodian of monetary policy, can only do so much. Interest rates are his primary instrument, and everything else is the responsibility of somebody else. Are you saying that that understanding of just the Reserve Bank's role being limited to that part of intervention, that type of interaction with the bond market, could be much broader than what it is?
Absolutely. I think it's an opportunity to go to Parliament in the amendment of Section 13 to allow him to do more. That's why I've got Parliament going on, and we can use that in the interest of the nation. I think not doing anything and hiding behind the existing act when we've got a Parliament whose role is to amend acts in the interest of the nation. That door remains open. I'm just urging him to really think bigger, to think smartly. We're not asking him to be irresponsible, Kaya. I'm not talking about just going in and printing money willy-nilly. I'm talking about supporting a sovereign in the face of really a collapsing economy should unemployment and poverty be worse than it is.
One of the magic ones that we expected from the minister last week was, of course, this idea of zero-based budgeting. So for a lot of people, they said, well, at least now he's going to be doing things differently. But again, my question is, even if he does budget using that framework, will it really make much of a difference given the fact that there's always going to be those baseline costs that you cannot avoid? And I think here, perhaps the civil service wage bill is one example, and a lot of the social services that we cannot avoid will still have to be paid for. So my question to you is, when it does implement that zero-based budgeting, do you expect much in the way of positive outcomes?
Okay, can I start with can I address what Lungile said and then move to that?
Yes, you may. Yes, you may.
So this is not this crisis, unlike the global financial crisis in 2008, is not a crisis that monetary policy can solve. And listen to many economists globally; they will tell you that this is a fiscal policy. This is a crisis that fiscal policy can really deal with, or should deal with, rather than monetary policy. But just for the sake of the listeners, I just want to also mention what the Reserve Bank has done thus far, and it has limitations. It can't save the economy. It has cut interest rates by 275 basis points this year. And as the Treasury official has mentioned, this compares to 100 basis points in other emerging markets. It also provided liquidity, abundance of liquidity to the banks, and the liquidity peaked at 83 billion rands in March. It has also provided regulatory relief for the financial sector. It has also provided 100 billion to SMEs, and this can go up to 200 billion. And obviously, the last one is that it has been buying government bonds in the secondary market. So it's just not one thing that it's done or two things. It has done enough in their limitations, and I can go deeper into the limitations. But to answer your question, so my take on the zero-based budgeting was because what has been happening all along is that budgets have not been utilized by government, by government departments throughout most of the financial year. And then what happens is that towards the end, the last few months, we start seeing this increase in spending. So this increase in spending and is typically spending in areas that don't create this economic multiplier effect that we want. And so in order to deal with this fiscal, with this buying immediately or quickly because you want to keep your budget in the next fiscal year plus inflation, Treasury then decided, and correct me if I'm wrong, to then adopt this zero-based budgeting to bring about efficiency in the budgeting process. And so what that would do, I think the bigger picture is that we're trying to grow the economy through infrastructure. And so we're going to align government expenditure with this infrastructure growth project that we've adopted or adopting. The difficulty here, and so it makes sense, yes, to align government spending. The difficulty here, I think there are two difficulties. Firstly, a large share, as I mentioned earlier, a large share of government expenditure has become autonomous. So you've got health, which is you can't do anything about. You have wages, you can't do anything about. You can actually, but you know it's very difficult right now unless you tackle the bull by its horn, which I think Treasury needs to do. You also have social grants and free education, and if you include the NHI there, you can't do anything that side. The other thing is that infrastructure implementation is mostly longer than a year. So budgeting has to, and planning has to budget for, you know, you have to align yourself to a multi-year budgeting process. So you can't just have a zero-based budgeting, which happens every year, when infrastructure budgeting is a multi-year budgeting process. And if you don't consider that, you will then have budgeting errors. So I think that those are the two difficulties that the National Treasury will find or will face. But I have been told today by a National Treasury official that they are looking into all these considerations, and they are going through various models and comparing how other countries have done it. I wish, and this is very typical of South Africa, that before announcing zero-based budgeting, I wish that they had actually done the research and modeling prior, so that when you do announce it, you can say, this is what the models have, the result of our modeling exercise, and this is why we've decided to go on this path. The risk with then announcing it is that if it's not feasible and it's very difficult to do, you either you won't do it, which is a credibility issue, or you'll be forced to do it and then it will fail, which is also a credibility issue.
Busi, speaking about the credibility issue that Tabby just raised, I mean, for me, one of the more interesting parts of last week's budget was the commitment by the government that they are going to get into a trade surplus, I think, within the next 2 or 3 years. Now, all one has to do is just open up any economic forecast or any data from the government itself for the past 10 to 15 years and show us that the direction has been the wrong way towards a deficit. How do we then believe that suddenly, in the middle of the greatest financial crisis that we're facing as a country, that the government now imagines that within a period of about 36 months, we're going to swing from the record deficits where we are right now onto a trade surplus for a start?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I just wanted to piggyback off of Tabi's comments there to say that in terms of zero-based budgeting, from the research that I've done, not many countries have implemented it at a country level. And, you know, in the United States, they abandoned it in the 1970s for various reasons. And I agree with Tabi that this should have been a question of, can this work in South Africa before you announce it? And I think I'm left with the question that says, what are the issues zero-based budgeting is really trying to solve? And it begs the questions of, you know, zero-based budgeting is about justifying spend, it's about, you know, decreasing costs, it's about all these different things. And my other question really is about, why hasn't Treasury been doing this all along? And you know, in the past, we criticized Treasury for cutting programs, but also I do think that participation and transparency has a big role. If Treasury says to us, we're cutting this infrastructure project because, you know, it's not working, and here's the proof that it's not working, I don't think people would criticize cuts to expenditure in certain areas of that nature. But I do believe that when we see cuts, we also want to see reprioritization in projects that do work. But the other thing is we want to see rethinking of projects. So for instance, one thing that's always stood with me was that a pre-screening programs funding pre-screening for cervical cancer program funding was reduced, right? And you wonder, like, the long-term costs of people having that cancer and us having to deal with it is way higher than fixing the program and making sure that the screening works. And so some of these programs need to be rethought and re-implemented in a different way. So are we really solving the problem by just saying, you know, this is not justified, we're just going to cut it? How are we safeguarding the projects that we really need? Maybe they're not doing well, but what if we really do need them, and how do we fix them is one of the things that I want to say. And I think in terms of a surplus, yeah, I absolutely do not believe that will be the reality. And particularly because I do think a lot of economists keep thinking we're going to have a V-shaped recovery. And I personally don't believe that will necessarily be the case. And, you know, there's U-shaped recovery, there's W-shaped recovery, there's many sorts of recoveries. And particularly with this context where we're seeing for the first time a collapse in demand and supply. This is really unprecedented. And I know people use the word unprecedented a lot for this crisis, but this is really something that's different. If you look at the medical or health crises that have happened, this hasn't necessarily been true at the scale that it has happened globally. And I do not think that we would have recovered by then to be able to have a surplus. And I think that really cutting the budget, as we know, right? We know that austerity doesn't work. That's sort of the work that I've really done on austerity and post-crisis response. And just to say that we know that depressing or cutting expenditure depresses the economy, right? And at a time where private sector expenditure is also declining. And what will happen is that GDP is going to go down instead of going up. And what does that mean? It means the GDP to debt ratio means that the debt to GDP ratio rather is going to go up. And so I am not convinced that those numbers are reflective of what's going to really happen and are way too optimistic. And I'm curious to know what the assumptions were in that modeling exercise and why Treasury believes this can be possible.
Quite fascinating. It was quite fascinating for a lot of us, and I'm hoping that towards the end we can get Mr. Sishi to give us some insights then. Lumkile, Tabi spoke about the work that the Reserve Bank has done. She spoke about the reduction in interest rates and all these other interventions. But I suppose the one thing that all economists will agree on is that the transmission mechanism associated with monetary policy interventions is historically and traditionally, and perhaps by design, quite lethargic. And my question to you, that given the sense of urgency associated with the need to save lives and livelihoods, could that really be the cornerstone of our interventions here, intervening in a system where you know that the response compared to the initial action is historically slow, quite lethargic, and of course doesn't match the sense of urgency that we needed in order to be able to recover, to deal with this crisis?
Thanks, Kaya. Firstly, Kaya, we must also be aware that a lot of the interventions that had come through Reserve Bank, that 200 billion rand guarantee has not been taken up to try and stimulate the economy. It's going very, very slow for the reason that you're highlighting around the transmission mechanism. That is why when the crisis started, engineers in our science councils did innovate. I know that UJ, for example, came up with innovation around ventilators. So we do produce cheaper ventilators, which are innovated by UJ. And it's something like that where Reserve Bank could go directly to fund that project for manufacturing. So what I'm saying to you is that the fact that South Africa is willing to take the risk of going with a begging bowl internationally, the fact that South Africa is not debating what to do with the reserves of the central bank and others, what to do with our savings in our pension funds, it's really a travesty of ensuring that me, who's saving, and many others were members of ABSIP, and the white business elite that has benefited immensely through the ANC policies since 1994 of taking our wealth away from the poor to the incumbent, the white elite, and the BEE beneficiaries. That distribution is going to continue on this trajectory that Treasury is recommending. And we know that this class, ABSIP and others, insensitive to the issues of the majority when the schools aren't delivered, and we require mass action to call government to account so that schools are delivered. We don't see this elite. We don't see the business elite. So the poor are left trapped there. It's a subject of discussion in cocktails. Surely we can do better. So what I'm saying to you, Kaya, is that this crisis is an opportunity for South Africans to redefine what they want. So what I'm seeing here is that we're choosing as South Africans to have the status quo of the past 26 years, where those that have access get better, live better, they've got their own private security, private healthcare system, and the majority are left because the state has got no money to finance those programs, to suffer on their own. Is this the South Africa that we want?
So those are very, very challenging questions. Tabi, I mean, when we do talk about the 500 billion rand scheme, we cannot discount the fact that the majority of the scheme, 40% of the scheme, was of course going to be the loan guarantee scheme. I think some of us sort of picked up even from inception that the design itself did cause particular problems. One of the design elements was that you had to be a client in good standing with your pre-existing bank before the crisis hit. Now, surely for a country that already understands how entrepreneurs struggle in particular and just how terrible the compliance burden can be on some businesses, even the design of the system itself was going to yield the inevitable undesirable outcomes that we're seeing now. So by the time the minister spoke, we still were looking at around 7 billion rand that had been disbursed over the 200 billion rand. And clearly for me, this implies that their good intentions notwithstanding, the Reserve Bank, having been responsible for crafting this alongside National Treasury, perhaps didn't get the right solutions mix on the table. And here we are now, 3 months down the line, 193 billion rand that hasn't materialized.
The loan guarantee scheme was not actually the Reserve Bank's idea. It was a private sector's idea. And I was not in favor, and I'm still not in favor of it, because we've had a similar scheme in the country and it was unsuccessful. And I knew that the uptake, looking at those conditions, that the uptake would be just as low when you put the same conditions as banks would ordinarily. So there was nothing that differentiated it much between a loan that didn't have those onerous conditions that banks have, but a loan that enabled small, medium-sized enterprises and the informal sector to tap into. So I'm not in support of it, and I'm not surprised that the uptake has been slow because of the structure of it. I think that if you removed it outside of the banking system and you put certain conditions that don't mimic the normal banking conditions, then I think that the uptake would increase. But as you've mentioned, that when you start saying you need to be in good standing and you put all these other conditions, it makes it very difficult. And it's the same with the informal sector funding, where we know a lot of the informal sector are not tax compliant, and a lot of them are not South African, and yet you expect to have these informal sector survive, or these people who are entrepreneurs in the sector survive, but you've put all these speed bumps, make sure that they don't actually get to the money because you've put all these onerous conditions to accessing the money. I just want to, I think we still haven't dealt with the problem here. And the Reserve Bank is not the problem. I keep saying this, and Lungile, you can happily send your pensions to Saving SA Inc. And I'm keeping my pensions. I don't want to even mention the Reserve Bank, balance sheet or the government balance sheet. I think I have longer to live than you, so I think my words have a lot more weight now. But the problem here is that, number one, by its own admission, the National Treasury in the budget has said that the wage bill has increased far more in the public sector than it has in the private sector. Actually, the private sector wage bill has been going down in the same period that the public sector wage bill has been increasing. By its own admission, the National Treasury also, according to its models, has looked at productivity, and also the World Bank has had great studies on productivity in South Africa. Productivity in South Africa is one of the lowest on the continent, and public sector productivity is extremely low. So the bulk, over a third of our budget goes to an area where there's low productivity. Doesn't make sense to me. I'd rather, my suggestion as a first step, cut government salaries by 15%. We've seen in the private sector, big listed companies are cutting salaries in order to survive, but the government remains untouched. Government wages remains untouched. I just don't understand how we can have discussions on the budget without having a discussion on this. I calculated that if you take the government wages and you slash it by 15%, you can raise just under 180 billion rand. And with that 180 billion rands, what I'd rather do is actually put money towards SMEs, put money towards the informal sector, and actually write checks to South Africans who've lost their jobs and to South Africans and increase the social grant, even if it's for a few months. I'd rather have that money be allocated directly to the economy. That's how you stimulate an economy, and leave it in wages of people who are deemed by the government itself as unproductive. Now, that's firstly. Secondly, I'll deal with the SOE problem. We do have an SOE problem and the reason why we've reached the consolidation that we set out in 2012, and we're going to consolidate and we're going to reduce the budget deficit. We reduce the spending ceiling. We continue to reduce the spending ceiling up until we got to the point where we had to accommodate Eskom. So we accommodated Eskom, we accommodated SA Express, we accommodated SAA, we accommodated Denel over the years, and we incurred a lot of costs. So money is going to areas that don't create this economic multiplier effect. So that's problem number 2. Problem number 3 is the composition of government in itself. I do not, I think that in a crisis, we are not acting as if the president, the finance minister, many officials globally have used the word war. I don't feel like we're responding to this as a war. I feel like we're just throwing money here and there. We're not really supporting the very people that need support, and that's the poor and those are the unemployed, those who have lost their jobs. I would change the composition of government. There are certain government departments as we speak that are not 100% functioning. And I would, as an example, if you're a minister in Syria, if you're a diplomat in Syria, for instance, you're called back. All the diplomats are called back. They're sitting at home and they're not doing what they should be doing had they been posted, as an example. I could also remove public enterprises and move the respective entities back into, SAA into transport, Eskom back into energy, for instance, and do away with a lot of rationalization. So there's various ways we do have funds. It's just that we are not utilizing the funds or allocating the funds efficiently in areas that can generate and help us with recovery.
Okay, no, thanks, Tabi. So panelists, there are some questions that we've got in our chat box. So I'll read all of them, and then when you can just answer them as part of your final remarks. So please pay attention. It's just 6 short questions. So the first one is, what is stopping government from lowering tax and VAT in order to stimulate the economy? That is from our first attendee. And then we also have one that says, I'm very critical of the supplementary budget in the sense that the minister only outlined what needs to be done, but didn't touch on the vehicle and tools he'll be using to achieve those goals. Can you please touch on that? The next one is, what or who is tying the hands and feet of National Treasury from acting against this huge wasteful expenditure? And how will National Treasury control spending by municipalities? The next one is, what is government What is stopping government from partially privatizing ESCOM and then subsidizing in order to allow electricity to be affordable to the poor? Surely the private market can do a better job. The next one is a bit long. To all panelists, why is there no focus on Treasury or the government on the strengthening of the currency so that economic growth can be stimulated? That is the question then. And then the last one is that, for me, the real elephant in the room is the fact that there are 30 plus other ministers. In the end, National Treasury is the only department that has to answer for the country. So why do we need the rest? So please, could you answer that? I'll start with you, Busim, Dumgile, and then Tabi. Brief, and yeah, those will be your final remarks also. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the one thing that I wanted to start by responding to is this notion that the wage bill is too large. And the reason why I don't agree with that is because I believe that it is actually the equity within the wage bill that's problematic. So for instance, if you look at health, there were 38,000 vacant posts in 2018. And I'm opposed to a blanket cut in salaries because particularly in healthcare, as an example, there are a lot of community healthcare workers who've just earned minimum wage. So that tells you something about how equitable the distribution in wages within that sector is. And I think that's something that we need to look at seriously, considering that there's so many vacant posts. So I don't think it would necessarily lead to a reduction in the wage bill size itself. I think what it can do is that we can get more value for our money by ensuring that we're able to deliver on the services that we need and that we've got personnel who are able to, you know, for instance, in healthcare, be able to deliver on all of that. And I agree that, you know, productivity levels are low, and I don't think the solution is cutting the wage bill. I definitely think the solution is how do we increase productivity. I think in terms of municipalities, I find that very interesting because that's one of the areas that we've been looking at the Institute to say that, you know, how will government really monitor and ensure that these budgets are what do you call it, implemented. And I think one thing that has been ringing through my mind really with regards to zero-based budgeting is to say that there are high-performing programs that are corrupt, and zero-based budgeting would actually not cut those off. And we need to think deeply about how we're going to deal with the issue of wasteful expenditure, of corruption, of municipal expenditure. And I think that's where I think, look, if corruption is 10% of expenditure, okay, fine, we need to deal with that. But if 90% of it is high-performing corruption, we need to make sure that we are getting really the value for our money. I agree. Well, I think in terms of the departments, it's very fascinating comment. I definitely think one of the things that I've been criticizing internally is this idea that National Treasury is the one that's driving the economic strategy of the country. And that's not to say that National Treasury is not capable or whatnot, but it's to say that a growth strategy of a country is actually something that has to intersect between the macroeconomic policy, which includes both fiscal and monetary. It has to be sectoral, it has to include labor policies. And I actually feel that parts of the growth strategy need to be considered within a unit that is all encompassing of all these different areas and not necessarily being driven by National Treasury alone. I think in terms of tools, you're right. We don't really know, or at least I don't know, based on my budget analysis, what kind of tools besides zero-based budgeting they'll be using to implement these programs. And in terms of the lowering the tax, that's the last one I'll tackle. I'd like to say that in my upcoming paper that I'll be publishing, what we found is that in the countries where they implemented tax cuts during a time like this, they found that the economic multipliers weren't as high as they'd anticipated. And that in fact, when they did have better economic multipliers, it's when they taxed people with higher incomes and so tackled that inequality. Because as we know, during this period, people with higher wealth and income are going to be holding on to that money instead of spending it in the economy. And therefore what's happening is that it depresses demand further because the people who don't have savings or can't hold on to money are just spending what they have, and that's declining. So just to say that I personally, based on my research, would not advocate for tax decreases or lowering of taxes during this period, because it'll maybe give us a little boost in demand, but I don't think it will give us enough of a boost that would make up for the lost revenue that we desperately need to be able to provision what we need to provision in this country.
Okay, no, thank you very much, Bosi. Lumkele, be very short because the DDG is going to be speaking after you. So if you have any great ideas, you might steal them. So be brief. Tell us your final remarks, please.
there's no use, Kaya, of increasing taxes or decreasing taxes when you've got a repurposed SARS, which is trying to rebuild itself given years of destruction and repurposing of institution by the Zuma administration. So it's got to be comfortable that when it has to increase them, it can collect. Similarly, to decrease them when you cannot collect to supplement what you've lost without the capability is a challenge. So that one is an internal issue where Kizvita is working hard to strengthen that. It's a working process. On the currency, Kaya, remember the currency cannot be stronger going forward, given that the currency reflects South Africa's risk profile. South Africa, as we all know, is a junk is rated as a junk status economy, high levels of unemployment, inequality, as well as poverty. A country, in fact, which some people argue, but that even the attempts of treasury of this program, which we call austerity, may not avert its decline into a failed state if the political questions, such as trimming the size of government, the cabinet specifically, is not done. So we may see ourselves in the next 2 years that wheels fall off on their way because the political decisions that are required are not being taken at all. Thank you, Kaya.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sishi, we are back to you. So you addressed us at the beginning when everything was very nice. And I think since then, things have taken a bit of a turn. So could you please just give us your comments on what you've heard from this conversation and also what National Treasury might be thinking about in relation to some of the questions that have been raised?
Thank you very much. And I appreciate the various comments and insightful questions and points that have been made. I think for my part, let me just say, we recognize the difficulties of these policy decisions, but that's not the same as saying that it should not or cannot be done. And so our attitude is that what we need to do in order to put the economy on a path to growth and prosperity needs to be done and put on the table, notwithstanding the fact that it's difficult, notwithstanding the fact that there are considerable disagreements in the country. I mean, South Africa is a robust democracy, and there will always be debates and discussions about various issues, as this panel discussion shows. Not everybody agrees on everything. The panel, for example, does not agree on things like wages and so forth. So these are things that we expect. These are things that we understand and that we are not surprised by. There is a difference between an economy that has had long-run structural constraints and one that is experiencing short-term demand shocks. Sometimes when a shock occurs, that shock can either come on top of a significant long-run structural constraint, or it can be viewed as a short-term problem that can be solved through some kind of demand stimulus. And in that regard, any comparisons between South Africa and many of the advanced economies, as has been indicated today, like the UK, break down. I'm glad the panelists appear to accept the proposition that increased government spending has empirically not correlated with economic growth over the last decade. That's certainly been the case, and the evidence proves that that's been the case. In fact, going back further than the last decade, the last 50 to 60 years, shows that the only time that government spending, an increase in government spending, has positively correlated with an increase in investment in the economy was during the first decade of the current century. And that, not even all of it. I'm also glad that there is an acceptance on the panel that the passive scenario is unacceptable. We agree, which is why we strongly believe that the active scenario that we have crafted, that we have received approval for from the Ministers' Committee on the Budget, as well as from Cabinet, can lay a path for future growth and prosperity. I also want to point out that debates around different options for how to address the fiscal problems and how to address poor long-run economic growth are taking place both within and outside of government. The only consideration in this regard is that decisions on policy must be based on empirical evidence and not ideology. And so far, the Treasury has maintained that approach strongly. On the issue of wages, I don't think that a Treasury that announced in the budget a 160 billion rand cut in the public sector wage bill lacks boldness. On the contrary, many analysts have indicated skepticism about whether or not we can do it. We are still convinced that we can do it, and we have the tools in our hands to do it, even though it will be extremely difficult, but we can do it. Indeed, the alternative to not doing it is something that we're not prepared to countenance, and we're not going to go down that road. Let me also point out that I think that a Treasury that has recommended the closure of state-owned companies, like we have, also does not lack boldness on the issue of what needs to happen in order to address the fiscal risks that are currently in place. In fact, we have been very specific around these issues, including in our economic strategy that we published last year. We've been very detailed about the sale and closure of certain ineffective institutions and agencies and companies that are a drain to the fiscus but are not adding to economic growth. I do want to address the issue of stimulus, which was raised. And I think I touched on it at the beginning. And I want to reiterate a couple of points from the data. As I said, South Africa suffers from deep-seated structural problems. And the presumption of fiscal stimulus appears to me to not take into account two things. Number one, the fact that our problems are long-run structural problems. And two, the fact that our current fiscal stance, and indeed our fiscal stance for a number of years, has been expansionary. We have been spending at higher levels than economic growth. And we have been increasing the levels of government spending, including in the current year. In fact, the fact that we are losing 304 billion rands in revenue and not taking any steps to reduce government spending in the current year is stimulatory by its very nature. On the issue of taxes and tax increases, you'd all be aware that we did raise taxes on the top bracket a few years ago, but we received no additional revenue from doing so. And I think it would be useful at some point to have a discussion as to why it is that raising taxes on the top bracket did not yield additional revenue for the state. The last thing I want to mention is around the issue of the problem of corruption and waste in government, which is a serious problem that we have been trying to deal with for a long time. Part of the difficulty we have is that we do have, and we have had relatively weak enforcement of the laws, including public financial management legislation in South Africa. The National Treasury is not a law enforcement institution, it's a fiscal policy institution. And so to the extent that we have had weakness in the implementation of ex post consequences for breaking financial management legislation, that has put the country on the back foot. in terms of being able to deal with corruption with respect to the public finances. But it's also true that corruption runs both ways. Someone once said, for every corrupter, there is a corruptee, or for every corruptee, there is a corrupter. And that to the extent that private sector players are able to extract rents from the state and are able to benefit from government regulations, it's very, very difficult to deal with corruption. And so it requires a more holistic view of how government works in the real economy. And it also requires a holistic view about our ability to enforce the laws of the country in respect of how we deal with people who commit fraud in general, whether they're in the public or private sector, and people who break the rules in this regard. Chair, I think I will stop there, except to say that I do think that we need to reevaluate the way we understand the relationship between government spending and economic growth. It seems to me that the best antidote for a lack of economic growth is economic growth. And how we ensure that that takes place is going to be the main focus going forward. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
All right, thank you very much, DDG, Mr. Sishi, for those inputs. And on that note, apparently I've been speaking for too long. People are starting to get annoyed with my voice, so I'd like to hand back to Thabiso Ratchifula. And thank you very much to my panelists and to the DDG for a very interesting and a very robust conversation. And of course, we're hoping that we're going to solve our country's economic crisis through dialogues of this nature. Thank you, and over to you, Thabiso.
Awesome, thank you, Kaya. Yeah, she's so, needless to say, I think there's a lot that needs to be done for the country. I think we've gained a lot of insight into just sort of the current state of things and the challenges that we face. I'd like to pay a special sort of thank you to actually the National Treasury for coming to join us tonight and really just, playing open cards, letting us know what you're thinking and considering. We know that you didn't have to, and from ABSIP, we just like to pay a special thanks to you. So in closing the night, I just want to thank all the speakers. To the DDG, Mr. Edgar Sishi, we thank you very much for your contribution tonight. To all the panelists, Lumkile, Tabi, Busi, we just want to really say thank you on behalf of ABSIP, and to all the members who've joined us tonight. I hope that the engagement was insightful. I hope it was useful and fruitful, and we hope to continue more engagements of these in the coming future. So thank you, and may everyone enjoy their night from ABSIP. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all.